All right, welcome to mini lecture 3 in module 2. In this short lecture, I'm going to introduce the concept of the demographic transition. It is discussed in your textbook in some detail, but I want to point out a couple of things in the context of our previous lecture regarding human population change. Remember in the last lecture we talked about births, deaths, and immigration, emigration. What I want to point out now is in the textbook they talk about something called the demographic transition. I want to point out its key concepts and some of its limitations. So, first of all, the demographic transition. The idea behind this is that we can describe or model a country's population dynamics based on these very simple factors of birth rates and death rates. Now, it makes sense that when both birth rates and death rates are very high, they kind of cancel each other out, and one would expect that population growth would be relatively stable. If either one of these changes significantly, we're going to see a change in population growth or population numbers. So for example here, green line being birth rates, red line being death rates. If birth rates remain high but death rates drop, well then we're going to add population. In other words, we reduce the number of deaths, so less people are dying, same number of people are being born, population is going to go up. If those two numbers then begin to approximate each other again, in other words, in this part you'll notice that the red line is still decreasing a little bit, but the green line is also dropping dramatically. What we're going to see is as those two lines come closer and closer together, the curve or the slope of the line is going to begin to decrease. And we get back to a point here where they're both very close and population again begins to stabilize. Well, that's the idea behind the demographic transition model. Now, the important idea in the model is that there supposedly are reasons for this. And again, this is based largely on data, past data, on the populations of the United Kingdom and of Europe. And so what we see, at least stage one, is what we would call a pre-industrial stage, in which people lived and people died at very high rates. In other words, we gave birth to lots and lots of babies, but lots of them died in childhood, and people didn't live very long. People died all the time with all sorts of rather trivial things. Now, as soon as we begin to have anything that reduces the death rates, the advent of germ theory, we began to understand germ theory, improvements in agriculture that made food more reliable, water and sanitation beginning to be something that's used, we begin to see death rates drop. And that's what you see here in what we call the early expanding stage, or stage 2. What then begins to happen, though, is as countries industrialize, the reason that we think, at least the argument is that the reason that birth rates were very high here is that it was still an agricultural economy. And so children in this area were seen as a benefit. They were an economic advantage, and so you had lots of kids. But if you have lots of kids and all of them survive, and you're living in an urban area where you have got to educate those kids and feed them and clothe them, and they can't work, they don't add anything to the equation, the argument is that you have smaller and smaller families. And that's what you see happening here. The final stage, stage 4 here, essentially is where much of the world is today, and that means that we have relatively few children, but we also have a low death rate. And so we begin to have that approximation. Now, the interesting question is what happens in the next phase, and that is the declining phase, where birth rates continue to go down, but because of the aging of the population, death rates continue to climb, and you begin to actually have a declining population. Okay, so now there's the theory of the model. Let's take a look at what it does in reality. One of the things that we can see is that there is some, in a sense, truth to this in the past. If we look very far back in time, the German model, in other words, if we take all the data from Germany, really follows that model quite well. And in fact, Germany's population has stabilized and begun to decline. So the model fits. The same is true of Sweden. But if we look at a place like Chile, what we can say there is that, boy, it seems to be taking an awfully long time for it to move from stage 3 into stage 4. You notice this gap here. It's still there. Well, Mauritius this gap seemed very high, came down quite a bit, and might be moving into that right now. China, well, China rapidly changed that dynamic, and in fact, we have some very strange scenarios here. So not everybody quite fits the model, and there are several reasons for that. In the case of China, very rapid decline in populations because of government control of birth rates. In the case of Chile, some have argued that this gap is because there's still a very strong cultural value in larger families. So we have to ask, does the model fit everywhere, and can we expect certain countries today to have that transition happen in a compressed time? Most of the countries, if you look above, took 200 years to move through these models. Is that what's going to be required of countries in other parts of the world, or even will countries move towards that? That's the big question. All right, that's it for the demographic transition. Again, remember, make sure you understand the 4 stages and largely what brings them about. All right, that's it.